Welcome to the closing event for a new kind of suburbia. I'm Dhruva Suhu, Head of Research and Practice Innovation at Metropolitan Workshop. And this event concludes a practice-based research project initiated by Metropolitan Workshop in 2019, which attempted to explore the challenges and opportunities for suburban places and people by drawing on learning from our growing portfolio of suburban projects and work with respected peers. We have selected this topic for our first annual research project because we were aware that the quality and potential of existing and new suburban neighbourhoods produced through the suburban speculative development model was taken for granted, but ever present and ripe for reconceptualisation and adaptation in the hands of skilled designers, policymakers and clients. The event coincides with the release of our practice publication, A New Kind of Suburbia, Reflections for Future Practice and Thinking, a record of the exhibition talks and roundtables held in 2019 within our London studio. It's worth saying it was when our Dublin studio was just first setting out. Today we have invited a panel of experts to discuss the loose conclusions we drew nearly a year ago in relation to their experience as practitioners and in light of emerging socio-economic and environmental challenges and opportunities confronting suburban places and residents. And I think probably the global pandemic is an issue of particular concern and opportunity for reflection. Our panel is chaired by Dr. Eleanor Warwick, Head of Strategy, Policy and Research at Clarion Housing Group, where she is responsible for embedding good practice about housing, placemaking and urban regeneration into the Housing Association's development, regeneration and asset management programmes. She's also the co-editor of our report alongside myself and Neil Deely. Joining Eleanor is Vincent Glacovara, Eddie Conroy and our very own Johnny McKenna. Vincent is Head of Planning at Enfield Council and was previously Head of the placemaking team within the Spatial Planning Service at London Borough of Croydon. He is also Director of Public Practice, a social enterprise seeking to enhance the quality of everyday places through capacity building within the public sector planning organisations. Eddie is County Architect within South Dublin County Council. He's been instrumental in realising several new town schemes, including Adamstown. He is co-author of the Design Manual of Urban Roads and Streets, a national standard covering the Republic of Ireland. And finally, Johnny, who joined Metropolitan Workshop in 2006 and is now director of our Dublin studio. He contributed to the successful delivery of residential schemes and master plans, both England and the Republic of Ireland. Within his team, he oversaw our Irish exhibition and has been instrumental in what I think is a truly remarkable expansion of our Dublin practice. Our panellists are all architects. They bring a wide range of experience of making and adapting suburban places at a local, regional and national level, whether that be through design-orientated planning policy, development strategies, community-based design governance, or commissioning, designing and delivering new suburban places. So I'm sure this is going to be a really interesting conversation. A little note about the format and the themes which Ellen has asked me to cover in the opening. So the format of the session is to hold a conversation among the panel for around 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the conversation to the entire practice. The first part will be recorded and the second part won't be. So when Eleanor gives the nod and we switch to the general conversation among the practice, we'll turn the recording off, and that's just so you don't feel, well, intimidated about being recorded. I don't know how the poor panel feel, but basically that's so that you don't worry about that. And I'm going to run through the themes very quickly, then I'll hand over. So we've selected 4 themes for today. The first theme is to really ask the panel about where and what suburbia is. And I know that sounds like a very simple question. It's hard, it's difficult. Suburbia is a very contentious subject matter, so they'll be thinking about the character and the challenges and opportunities for the suburbs. Theme 2 will ask the question, how will future suburbs be shaped? Theme 3 will question who should have a say in suburban places, and then who should benefit from any refurbishment or future development that occurs. And finally, we'll be asking the question about what the role of professionals is in the development of suburbs that cater for all. So how do we design and manage productive suburbs? And the last little instruction before I hand over is basically, if all of the speakers can turn on their cameras Everybody else can mute and turn your cameras off. And the way we're going to draw you into the conversation around 30 minutes is please by raising your electronic hand, but I'll also be monitoring the chat so that if you're too shy to ask in person, I'll read the chat out, but we really would like you to be involved in the conversation if you can. Okay, Eleanor, over to you.
Lovely. Well, welcome everybody, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and it was a real pleasure to be involved in the exhibitions which fed into the document that you've actually had to sort of like see. And welcome to sort of Eddie, Johnny and Vincent. And I think Drew has asked me to chair this, mainly to stop me talking too much. So having sort of said that, I think we've got 4 really fascinating questions to start with, and I think I'm expecting quite a diversity of views on this first one, which is what does suburbia mean to you? And I thought it would be nice to start with Johnny, to sort of think about, you know, what is it, and what is it about the challenges and the opportunities about both existing or new urban places?
Thanks, Eleanor. What is suburbia? I suppose I speak from very personal experience. I grew up in suburban Dublin. You know, it was a place called Ballantyre. So it was at that time, you know, the very edge before it was mountains, and now it's not so much that anymore because the suburbs have grown out from that. For me, like, you know, it's a very broad spectrum. I mean, at its best, it's kind of the heroism of the garden suburbs and that sort of brave new world, and what at the time were sort of seen as health mad pioneers, you know, doing something that was very, very different. And at its worst, it's perhaps you know, the proliferation of what we see everywhere, which is just the language of semi-detached houses side by side that, you know, when done badly has the ability to render any place almost contextless. So, you know, it's this kind of big range that means quite a lot of things. So it's very hard to define exactly what it is, but it is a place that a huge percentage of the population, you know, spends most of their time in or grew up in. So I think, yeah, that's it's a very interesting subject to look at, but not an easy one to pin down.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges, isn't it? That we sort of see the idea of suburbs as being something very homogeneous, and actually it isn't. And Vincent, do you want to come and tell us a little bit, particularly about, you know, your personal take on suburbia, but also Enfield, because as a suburb, Enfield is fascinating, and the things that you're doing there are fascinating.
Yeah, so I think the first point is it is impossible to define and pin down. We kind of all have an idea of what it is, suburbia, but it's within that there's lots of different definitions and experiences, and I think you're kind of destined to fail if you try to define it too closely. I think probably there's a historical reality about the way cities have grown, and that there was probably a time where suburbs, I mean, the Romans had suburbs, didn't they? On the places on the edges of the cities that were probably similar to some of our suburbs, lower density than the bits in the centre. But what's happened probably over the last couple of hundred years is that a type of development has also generated a culture that is also suburbia is about the culture of suburbia. It's not just about the physical reality of suburbia. So the music and literature and identity that comes with it, which can then be sort of cut and paste into lots of different contexts, as can the form of suburbia. So you get sprawling places in North America, for instance, which are probably they've got the kind of characteristics of suburbia, but whether they're technically a suburb of another place is another question. So it's complicated, isn't it? But very interesting. That's why it's so interesting. I mean, like Johnny, I grew up in suburbia, so in suburban Croydon, in a semi-detached house. I didn't know that's what it was when I was living there. It was just the place where I lived. But it's probably partly why I'm so interested in those kinds of places. And while studying architecture, the fact that it's kind of suburbia is almost universally scathed made sort of further piqued my interest in it. And it's probably why I'm working at Enfield Council now. It's why I worked for Croydon Council, and it's why I'm working working in Enfield. So it's an interest in those places that are on the edge, that have some of those characteristics, possibly also a bit of those places that are possibly not always university liked for whatever reason, or misunderstood. I find interesting. So I mean, that's certainly the case when I was at Croydon, but also in Enfield. Often places that are misunderstood, that have so much that's wonderful about them that can be missed, and so much opportunity. That's certainly certainly the case in Enfield. And as a suburban place like Croydon, Enfield is also an ancient settlement. It's not all suburb. It's got its own distinct placeness to it. So it's not just a suburb of another place. It's its own distinct place. But it has also got those neighbourhoods which are the sort of interwar suburbia that is very familiar in terms of how, in the UK context, we sort of see or define suburbia. So there's that kind of 1930s interwar semi-detached suburbia that makes up a large part of Enfield, and is where a lot of the change and the evolution and the growth is going to take place over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
That sounds amazing. And Eddie, coming to you, sort of both your personal sort of take on what suburbia is, but equally in terms of thinking about new towns and new settlements and new sort of like suburbs, what would you feel that suburbia is and could be, and its challenges?
I've kind of found it, fellow Sol and Vincent there, your description of Croydon and Enfield, both places I'm very interested in. But I always think of the suburbs as a kind of, it could easily be a time as well as a place, defined by that. If you imagine initially, say, Dublin, the suburbs of Dublin ran out along train and tram lines, and that was the kind of, but in the 30s, like in the UK, and say Metropolitan Line and Metroland, it became a kind of about the process of housing. And then towards the 70s and 80s, and Johnny's talking about in Ballantyre, it became a kind of an algorithm of housing. And all the problems we have with that now about low density, car dependence, impermeability, absence of enclosure, all the things, the kind of physical things of those, and which are reflected as well in, say, the reduced type of building options, that it's private if it's semi-detached, it's public if it's fixed, and the kind of all the social difficulties that you were talking about earlier on, Eleanor, in relation to the scheme behind you there, are rooted in the suburbs. Now, I suppose I initially worked in Dunleary, which is one of the older parts of the Dublin suburbs, and it was very nice there. It's a kind of a regency area, and I did a lot of housing, which I used to describe as polishing up the family silverware. It was all these little infill sites, and it was very nice as an output. But in the end of the day, I come out here, which is much more problematic. It's a residual place where a lot of people moved from the inner city in the 70s and 80s, quite late, in big housing programs, and all. You're familiar with the implications of that now, but. We kind of have it was the bigger Dublin County Council was a huge area, and they divided it into 3 councils in the mid-90s. And again, like an Irish bull, South Dublin County Council is to the west of the city, just in case anyone wasn't confused. But it's a place that's open, and it's a place that's about social justice, and it's about community, all of those things. But also it's a building laboratory for things that happen. So we were, the SDZ process, Strategic Development Zones, kind of master planning, was initially envisaged for industrial things, but we harnessed it for housing. Adams and Clonburris are about that. And again, looking to Europe, we were thinking of what would transit-oriented development be like. So we started to look at places that would be on stations. And it's an old model, like it started with the Metropolitan Line, but goes through Copenhagen and Stockholm and all these places. So our kind of work is about somehow what would a large version of these places look like, and then when we're talking about intensification, we'll go into more of that. But I think that's if you thought about, we were looking for an antidote to the displacement and all of that was happening in suburbia. and unfairness and absence of access to education and car dependence, all of the stuff that does intractable things. We were looking for antidotes to those. Some of those antidotes are small scale, that's the road standards, and that some of them are big scale master plans. So I suppose that's where we live, and it's kind of challenging. But I'm very pleased that Johnny and Metropolitan Workshop are doing a very big project for us. So he's joined the fight.
I love
out here on the west side.
I love that. That segues absolutely beautifully into our sort of like next theme, because I do think this sort of sense of a misunderstood place, the idea of something on the edge, whereas, you know, edgy is not always the way that we would describe the suburbs. I think that's the thing which is really intriguing. It's on the edge, but not of the edge, not sort of, you know, that sense of, would you ever describe sort of suburbs as cutting edge? I'm not sure. So for Eddie to be able to sort of say, look, here is the laboratory for us to try out, not even new ideas, but somehow reinvent existing ideas that we know might work well. I think it's really interesting that you picked up this point about, and we're doing it en masse, we're doing it on scale. You know, it's actually something we have to respond to in a different way. And Johnny, I was thinking, if we could think a little bit about what tools do we have? How are we going to sort of like change future suburbs? What's the work that you're doing? What is going to be the particular sort of like approaches that you are going to be sort of like applying? You know, what's the role of design in or planning policy in those new places that we are making, and that you are and the practice are making?
Yeah, I suppose it's a few things really. I mean, there's maybe two different approaches to this. Like when we talk about suburban intensification, on the one hand, that's intensifying suburbs that already exist, and on the other hand, it's new places like Clonburris, but probably more typically, you know, it's greenfield stuff at the edge of existing suburbs, you know, which Clonburris kind of isn't. Clonburris is sort of surrounded by existing places already, although it is a very big place. So like taking the former one there, you know, what are the challenges to intensifying existing suburbs? Like there, I think it's a lot to do with sort of land ownership. I mean, suburbs are one other way of defining the suburbs is probably the I suppose the proliferation of private land ownership over public land ownership. You know, so very large back gardens, very large front gardens, etc., etc. And when you know, people have done studies about how suburbs can be intensified, but the big stumbling block often is that you have lots of separate private ownerships, and how do you sort of deal with that? So, you know, that's one area. I'm not entirely sure what the answer is to that. I expect some sort of, you know, cooperative housing model, something like that everybody kind of gets together, and it's a little bit of mix of top up and or bottom up and top down. I think the other thing is, like in Ireland, and I'm not sure in the UK, but like we have development plan standards that we sort of need to respect, and those development plan standards are often I suppose often designed around the suburbs. Now, in Dublin City, inside the canals, they're slightly relaxed, but you know, once you get outside that, they're fairly standard, sort of 20 to 22 metre face-to-face distances, etc. So, you know, perhaps there is a conversation to be had about a more qualitative approach and a quantitative approach, and I think that's where, you know, skilled architects can come in and you know, help in that conversation about intensifying the suburbs. But and then when you get out to the sort of the larger suburb, or sorry, the more greenfield areas, I think, and again, like I can only really speak from an Irish perspective on this at the moment. It's been sort of 5 years since I've worked on any projects in the UK, but like a lot of it is to do with sort of governance and policy. I think by the time the architects are brought in and the urban designers brought in, it's often sort of chapter 3 of the book and the plot's already been established. So for me, it's kind of about, you know, how do you, I suppose architects as a profession probably need a seat at the table, or need to force themselves a seat at the table, and I think that's what a lot of it is about. I think you can have very skilled architects, but there are some fundamental issues that aren't really to do with that.
Mm. And that immediately, so sort of like Eddie, you really interesting mentioned the mechanisms that you have under your control, the STZ and that sort of process. How helpful do you think that can be to encouraging good quality design and good quality new places?
It can be very helpful, but it has limitations. I suppose, just to take up further on what Johnny was saying, if you think of when we started to look at, say, that idea about new places, at the time, which this is like maybe 20 years ago, it doesn't feel that long, but we started to look at, say, American models, new urbanism, and that was we were looking at these great transect drawings, you know, which how would you start to build a place that was somehow more than an accretion of incremental housing schemes, which is, if you think about the time argument again, really what happened in Dublin and in the UK is the same, building of big roads, and then the schemes work up along the roads and back into each other. So the great problem for us was, how do you get so that, for instance, it's a loose grid? How do you do that? That it becomes like, say, Rieselfeld in Freiburg or Milton Keynes. And the master plans are great for that. You can set those out. Like it's funny, we've two master plans, that big one at Adamstown, which I was able to describe in a way to somebody as, when we did it first, as there's a railway station and there's 3 big roads run to 3 big parks, and the roads are built, and then everything else is loosely gridded. Clonbus, that Johnny's involved in, is a bigger scheme, but I can't describe it. I don't know what the narrative is. Already these things, when they reach a scale where you can't describe them anymore, it starts to become more difficult. But if you think about these, though, the biggest problem, I think, in it is, number one, how they're delivered. I'm sure we'll be talking about this afterwards. What's the agency? For instance, we delivered the Adamstown, the earlier parts of Adamstown, because we had no land there. It was all about leverage. It was a kind of a chimera, because the land values were increasing then with the wall of money just before Lehman's, and we were able to leverage more and more from the developers. The prices were going up and up, which worked as long as it worked. And when it didn't work at all. In Clonbus, we own 1/3 of the land. So now we're participants, we're stakeholders, skin in the game. It's not great. And it's much more problematic, because now we have to be part of, say, larger infrastructure clusterings that have to lay down and we have to think about funding mechanisms, and we have to think about how does the funding mechanisms relate to tenure type, for instance, particularly affordability, whether that's rental or whether that's purchase. So it becomes a complex beast with everything, legal things, money things. But I still come back to what Johnny's saying, is that in the end of the day, there's something about what the morphology of this thing is. The morphology makes the connections, protects the sustainability, the long cycle routes, the position of schools so that kids can walk rather than having to be driven. All the big choices that really have been impossible to do can be delivered in these. The difficulty is it all takes longer than we thought. We used to think that we'd build Adamstown out and it was going to be, about 10,000 houses. We thought we'd deliver that in, 5 or 10 years. It's going to take 20 or 30 years. And in that 20 or 30 years, the speed of the sine curve, the up and the down, the layman's and they get faster and faster. So things like, for instance, larger scale infrastructure projects become riskier and riskier. So we have to have some kind of parallel process where you, on the one hand, you lay down tracks into the future, 20 or 30 years in the future. On the other hand, you have immediate things that you're trying to do, like that nice scheme behind you there, and that what Johnny's talking about, the textures, the technology, the response to all the things that is the inch in front of the saw. And somehow balance those two. And increasingly, it's not easy, but increasingly it's more and more worthwhile.
And I think it's thinking of that historical opportunity. We come down to the fundamentals that we always come down to with sort of like new developments. This issue of land, of ownership, of governance, of who has a say. How do you become a stakeholder? I'm very interested in the role of development corporations and new settlements, and how can they actually be locally led and locally have some sort of like sense of purpose here. And I think we have the mechanisms, but each time in each particular locality we almost have to reinvent them or find what is going to work into a particular place. Yeah, and I think that is really interesting, both to think of who has the power in that, and hopefully we'll get to talk about that later. But Vincent, I was wanted to come back for your take on that, and your take particularly on this what are these mechanisms that we have to shape, you know, to really to sort of like shape and change, and then I might even have a question about current policy in the UK and in England, which I think has its eye on suburbia at the moment.
So I mean, from a planning perspective, there's obviously there's a whole policy toolkit and ways of doing things, so processes that you can choose to adopt or not, but I often think that the system that we've got is fantastic for that reason, in that there's actually lots of things that are possible within there. It's not necessarily the case that we make use of all of those tools, but many of them are there to actually do some quite brilliant stuff. It just doesn't tend towards it unless you have the right people and the right, you know, the kind of the stars aligning sometimes to know how to make use of what's available. But as I was listening to Johnny and Eddie talk there, I was thinking about the kind of the old sort of freedom and control balance, the balance between freedom and control, which things are fixed, which things you leave flexible, and also the Stuart Brand quote about buildings never being something that you start, not something that you finish. And the thing about places is that they're in their planning is that they have to sort of be both always unfinished and always finished, so that at any point in time they work and are enjoyable and deliver whatever they need to deliver at a point in time, but that they're not fixed, that there's always that latent capacity for change and flexibility, and for them to be enhanced, which actually suburbia or suburban places are very good at. They've got that kind of latent inbuilt. I've described it as sort of slack, but I've talked about it before as a kind of law of unforeseen planning. That there's the semi-detached on a smaller scale. Semi-detached house is a perfect example where it was not designed for front gardens to be car parks, but it is, you know, unintentionally perfectly designed for that. They weren't designed to be extended in the ways that they are extended, or for the gardens to be used in the way they are now, but they've got that kind of inherent flexibility designed into them, rather than the kind of open-ended flexibility of a big open box. You know, they're very specific, but also very flexible, and you can scale out and think about suburban places in a similar way, that they've got those kind of they've got that level of specificity in the way that they were initially designed, but they've also got bags of potential and flexibility to accommodate all kinds of scenarios, many of which we can't even imagine. And so in terms of coming back to the policy and planning approach, I think it needs to accommodate that and be cognizant of the fact that there are some things that you can and should plan, and there's other things that you need to be completely comfortable with the idea that you kind of let it go, and it can be whatever it will be, which is difficult when, particularly when historics or older suburban places, they're not necessarily even that historic, but the interwar ones, for instance, end up becoming heritage assets, or if not literally conservation areas, they become so sort of embedded and enshrined in cultural memory that people don't want them to change, even though they are inherently, you know, that point around that Eddie made around them being a point in time rather than a specific thing. It's absolutely the case, isn't it, with not just suburbs but cities, that they're all constantly changing, and it's the truism, isn't it, that they're constantly changing and evolving. But because of that potential that's inbuilt into suburbia, because of the space, probably it's that they've got more baggier space, that they're more capable of accommodating those kind of various different futures, which is what makes them exciting, I think.
It does,
and scary.
And scary, and that that sort of segues on into sort of like our
And
third.
edgy. I mean,
And-
I like the
yeah.
point about edgy,
Yeah.
and I just wanted to. I think the fact that they don't appear to be so edgy is what makes them even edgier. You know, it's not an accident that punk comes from the suburbs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that who gets to have a say is the bit that I'll come to next. But I did want to ask Vincent just one last policy question, because certainly in England, there's a real sense that policy interest is focusing in on the suburbs, the way that design coding is going to work, the way that Policy Exchange have recently had a report on strong suburbs, which is a way of trying to encourage whole streets to come together to sort of take control of planning. Do you think that's because there's this untapped democratic pool in the suburbs, or do you think it's seen as in policymakers' terms as an easy target?
I think it's probably because there's the reality that a large proportion of the growth that needs to be accommodated, and the need that is arising is coming from these places. So, and that they are. It's a challenge, isn't it? There, how that's managed. Some of that change is going to be things that everyone would easily sign up to, like new cycle. Well, not everyone. Lots of people sign up to new walking and cycling infrastructure, better public transport, schools, health centres, even some development of affordable housing. But some of it will be stuff that people don't want, or at least it will be contentious. So I think that's probably the reason, and it's quite right. There needs to be focus on it. It can't just be left. It's too important just to be left. But I think that's probably it.
That's probably why it's honing in on it.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm conscious the conversation's going well in terms of time, so I'll probably finish with this as the final sort of question before we open it out, so other people can have questions as well. But Eddie, I think this is raising this whole issue of who does and who should get a say in how suburbia is developed. Who, Vincent was touching on. Planners may have a particular view of how it is. You started to sort of like talk about wanting to talk about governance and who's going to shape the long-term stewardship of the suburbs.
Yeah, that's very problematic here. I know that I think that the idea of the suburb has become so ingrained. That algorithm I was talking about earlier on in people's ideas about what's a 2-story house versus a 3-story house versus a 4-story house. And there's a lot of, say, for instance, if people were to be involved in that level of governance, I'm not sure another house would be built in most parts of Dublin anyway, whatever, but anywhere else. So there's a lot of NIMBYism and that protection of property values and all this goes with that. To the point where disguised as concern about affordability and all the rest of it, recently City Council has voted down several very nice schemes, very well designed and interesting schemes, to stop them or to change them from a tenure mix into social housing. And as a result of that, the government has set up a land development agency as a kind of a vehicle, a MacGuffin, for taking over public sites and centralising how they're delivered. And in a strange way, planning here has become a kind of a very strong bureaucracy. There's a technical bureaucracy to do with standards and codes, which in recent years, the government has, for instance, described the whole of Dublin as a metropolitan consolidation zone, or whatever title. But it's the idea is to try and increase densities and increase heights. And again, if I had a tattoo, if I was ever going to have a tattoo, it would be "the cure is worse than the disease." And in this case, it's about the idea that the result of that hasn't been entirely successful, because even simple things like 30 to 50 units to the hectare are beginning to produce strange amalgams that really aren't informed by larger ideas of place or what makes a nice environment. And as time goes by, the height has turned into another degeneration of land values and things, so that there's strange buildings arriving everywhere, popping up out of the ground. And so I think we have a particular problem with that. Also, the way the local authorities are arranged is that operationally planning, development management is done through the executive, and development strategy is done through the elected members. So that gap has left all sorts of issues as well. So I suppose I don't mean to sound negative about this, because centralised planning and centralised ownership has enabled things to move forward. It doesn't always suit people, but it will ultimately when they're done, which doesn't sound very democratic. But I think there's something about how do we get those processes out. And increasingly, that's to do with consultation. And strangely, COVID has improved that. We used to have meetings where people would gather, and the loudest voice would really flatten the meeting out after about 30 minutes. Now they're all done on Zoom, and it's incredible. The people who normally don't speak do. Groups who normally are represented suddenly appear. So strangely, COVID has improved representation. Currently doing the development plan, and it's the most democratic one I've seen yet, because people can in a wide number of ways. So I think, yeah, I'm sorry if that's rambling, but that wouldn't be the first time I've rambled, as Johnny will tell you.
It's good, and it's a very pertinent reminder that I am supposed to be opening this sort of discussion up to the wider sort of workshops, so that they're able to ask you sort of questions as well. But if I can just finish then with the question that I've asked after the others, Johnny, with this bit about who should have sort of like control, who, and particularly in design terms, this thing about informal intensification, the freedom quite often it feels within the suburbs to take control in your own hands, to make places how you would like them to be. Do you think that's something that designers can actually foster and encourage? That sort of like loose fit places will grow around what they need to be.
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, I also sort of slightly back up Eddie in what he was saying. I mean, certainly my experience here is that, development would probably never happen if everybody was allowed, or if everybody was able to have a kind of an equal say. So it is a tricky situation. I mean, but by the same token, we have this process over here in planning terms, which is called strategic housing development, and that's where you have like a development of anything over 100 homes has to go through this process, but it effectively sort of bypasses any sort of public consultation. And so that's kind of the other extreme, and that system will probably be reviewed as a result of that. But like what was happening before that is large developments were spending years in planning sometimes because of additional information, and that wasn't really working satisfactorily either. I think, I mean, what can architects do to help this along? Certainly, like in Metropolitan Workshop, I think we probably have a few projects that wouldn't be projects without our involvement, and that might be because we were involved in something next door and we sort of saw an opportunity, and you look beyond the red line boundary and you try and help move things along that way. And that's a sort of an interesting space to be working in. But I think just picking up something Vincent mentioned earlier on about this sort of law of unintended consequences, I think, like, I suppose the non-cynic, or the opposite of being a cynic in me, says that most politicians are there trying to do what they think is the best job they can. And in Ireland, certainly, over the last few years, we've had updates to our apartment guidelines, we've had updates to our height standards, we've had updates to our complete sort of overhauls of our planning application system, etc. But it sort of feels that they've ended up doing things that they weren't intended to do, because nobody, maybe they should have spent a sort of a 6-month period with a bunch of architects saying, here, go out and see what this all means, like draw up 5 versions of scheme based on this policy and see what happens. Because what we've ended up with really is, if you have a suburban area, and now we have to build sort of between 35 to 50 dwellings per hectare in a suburban area, you'll end up with this carpet of, generally you'll end up with this carpet of sort of 3-bedroom semi-detached house, and then a kind of a big building at the end, to jack up the density. And I don't think that's kind of what was intended by it. So, I think that sort of We need more testing of these policies.
And I have to give Vincent the chance to sort of like respond to that, because I do know all the amazing work you did in Croydon with the sort of all those different neighbourhood characterisation, housing-led, design-led codes for places, and now what you're doing in Enfield really successfully is exactly trying to counter. I think, you know, I so recognise what you've been saying about there are rules and how they actually get played out on the ground doesn't actually really happen, and I think Enfield, you know, how come you're managing to counter that so well?
We're on a journey, as they say.
Okay. A positive one from this side.
Yeah. But in terms of sort of policy development, I completely agree that not only architects but many others should be involved in at least in helping test draft policies or emerging policies and the evidence that sits behind them, so that by the time they're adopted, they have the best chance of actually doing the thing that they're supposed to do. But for whatever reason, how the system's structured, how consultation works on these things, maybe awareness in just to pick the architectural industry, whether that many architecture practices are out there waiting for the next local plan consultation to drop so they can sit and test all the policies in it. I don't know how many practices do that, but I think it would be, you know, it would definitely add value to the policies that end up being crafted if that happened. But then towards the other end of the process, I mean, they'll never be 100% right, and there'll always be unintended consequences. And then I suppose the feedback loop's really important then. So how does that feed back into policy development and the ongoing process? One thing I'm really interested, haven't done it yet, but I'm interested in how post-occupancy research could feed into planning policy development. And it may be happening in some places, but I haven't seen it. I haven't seen that particular loop being created. For instance, like whether it's through Section 106 or conditions, you can actually require post-occupancy studies that then go into the evidence base for policy development, so that you're continuously refining and updating things. It's what's supposed to happen, but whether it's quite clunky.
Yeah,
the way it actually happens in practice, and because the timescales for local plans are so long, aren't they? I know there's white papers promoting doing it much more quickly, which has its own implications. But setting up some processes where that you're actually genuinely getting real feedback into policy development, I think would make for much better plans.
It is a long-term process. I'm going to close up now and open up some questions from everybody else who's listening. But I do think that point, because it picks up something that both Johnny and Eddie and Vincent, you've sort of said about actually this is a long-term journey, and you know, if the suburbs are places that you think you might want to spend your life, you can spend a whole sort of like career, design and planning career, delivering and changing those. So there's Eddie, do you want to jump in and one last point? Yep.
Just to add to what Vincent was saying, I'm very interested in this idea. You know, in terms of people use that phrase in terms of education opportunities, you can't be what you can't see. I'm kind of interested in this idea of solutions that become templates, or that become kind of like a DNA of how things can be resolved. So that's what I think is very interesting about this project with Metropolitan Workshops, is that it features worked examples. Like it has a kind of a DNA for changing it. And I'm kind of fascinated by, if we were talking what Johnny was saying there about the difficulties in this 50 model, where it's all houses and then a big 6-story at the end. But there are versions of it, and I think if we start to see work models that are be introduced into the stream, into the kind of genetic planning, that if they can be shown worked examples, like I'm an architect like everybody. I'm happier reading magazines than and looking at pictures than reading text. So looking at schemes or that contain these things, that idea of introducing those DNA elements in it, I think are a powerful tool to get at architects, to convince them or to show them. That's how they learn.
That's great.